Hello everyone. As a child, one of my favorite board games was the game Robo Rally. In this game, every player controls a robot and has to complete an obstacle course with it as quickly as possible. The crux, at the start of each round, the player issues 5 commands that will then be executed in sequence afterwards. Then every player resolves their turn, the robots interact with each other while doing their pre-programmed actions, and chaos ensues as the robots push each other around unpredictably. This was one of the first games that sparked my interest in algorithms, giving a whole set of instructions to a robot so it completes a task for you, without monitoring it in real time afterwards. When professionals develop algorithms today, they often look for efficiency. An algorithm should be quick to execute. They look for precision. The algorithm should do the task as well as possible. That is not what I care about. I like algorithms that arrive at their goal in strange ways. For a long time, I've been thinking about automating rotations in Guild Wars 2. The problem with it, though it is a good thing, is that it is against the terms of service of Guild Wars 2 to use a macro for a rotation. So whatever I theorized about, an algorithm running a rotation would only ever stay a theory. Right? Well, yes and no. I can still develop a pre-programmed sequence of inputs. I just have to press them myself. In order to do this, I have to become the robot. I have to program myself. Now, the most striking difference between me and artificial intelligence, except for my comparative lack of human emotions and behaviors, is that I'm not nearly as precise at following a set of instructions as a computer. A computer with its internal clock can easily, precisely execute a rotation algorithm, every single time without fail. I cannot do that. So I need extra tools. As an amateur musician, I have a metronome easily available to me to time my inputs. I can set it to any pace I want, and then just repeatedly press a skill sequence on that beat. So I'm all set. What remains to do is to develop a rotation that works under these constraints. I began with Condition Virtuoso. I wanted to keep it as simple as possible on my keyboard layout, so I was able to easily sequentially input the buttons. Buttons I press in this order go from left to right on my keyboard. F1, 2, F2, 3, 5, 0. And then F1, 2, F2, 3, 5, F5. And then repeat those actions. There are several things to say about this. First off, I very often press buttons that are unavailable at the moment. This is not a problem. The game will just remind me that the button is on cooldown, ignore the command, and do an auto attack instead. For example, I don't precisely know when my F1 is coming off cooldown, so I have it at 2 places in the loop, which means if I have it up, I'm going to press it at one of 2 places, and probably not on the other place. The second thing you'll notice is that the frequency I've selected, 67 beats per minute, will reliably use my dagger 3 and my sword 5 off cooldown. You see, one loop on this beat will take 10.7 seconds. The effective cooldown, that is the cooldown plus the cast time of a skill, of those two abilities are 10.04 seconds and 10.48 seconds respectively. The dagger 2 is pressed twice in each of those loops. The F2 will alternate between being pressed in the first part of the loop and in the second part of the loop. And the F5 finally is pressed every second loop. Now, with this simple algorithm, playing almost the same line twice on repeat at 67 beats per minute, we get something that is actually a decent impression of a rotation. As you can see, we are approaching nearly 35k DPS, which is pretty nice. I can say, well, Condition Virtuoso is a particularly brain-dead example of a spec. Of course, doing something like that will amount to great DPS on a golem. My curiosity was triggered, and I went to investigate what other builds could achieve. The idea remains the same. Give a sequence of skills that, when pressed repeatedly at a certain set pace, will produce great DPS. So the next build I looked at was Condition Willbender. The sequence I found here was even shorter than the one for Condi Virtuoso. I played at 83 beats per minute, F1, 2, 3, 4, F1, 7, 8, 4. There's actually a lot more going on here than you may think. One of these 4s, and it doesn't matter which one, is activating the Torch 4, which is an instant cast ability. And the second 4 press is throwing it. By virtue of the loops being short enough, this will always work as there are only 4 buttons, that is to say, 2.9 seconds between activation of the torch and throwing it. The F1 will be pressed essentially off cooldown, either in the first sequence or in the second part of the sequence. And every other button is also pressed essentially perfectly. We even pair up the whirling light with a fire field, which is really cool for extra burning. The fact that this build crushed Condi Virtuoso's DPS so very easily made me want to extend this project to every spec. Can I give a build for every one of them that performs similarly? Or were these two builds just exceptionally good? Vindicator was next, and it was the first time where I actually struggled to find something useful. My approach here was a lot more trial and error. You notice I dropped Alliance Legends for Chalice. That's because I noticed that it's very difficult to make a distinction between using impossible odds and Alliance skill. That part would have been fine, albeit not ideal for DPS. And also, using Alliance Elite somewhere in the rotation without making it possible to accidentally use Shiro Elite. This can be done by making sure you simply do not have the energy for it when you press the Elite, but it's still a lot of hard work to get there. Both of those challenges would have been solvable, but ideally an Alliance rotation casts the Elite skill twice, so once at the start and once towards the end, which just does not line up with the rest of the idea. With this algorithm, it can be better to focus on making the core stuff of the rotation line up perfectly, rather than making something niche work that's not even a big part of the rotation's DPS. So Chalice proved both simpler and in the end more DPS because of it, because it allowed me to optimize other parts where there is more damage to gain than just the gain from the Alliance Elite skill. At 70 beats per minute, one of these loops takes 10.2 seconds, and since it starts with Legend Swap into turning on Impossible Odds or Vengeful Hammers, that's exactly what we want to have anyway. The Sword 4 and Sword 5 are used alternatingly in the first or second half. Dodges are spent depending on our endurance. We made sure to follow up the F2 with a dodge to avoid capping out endurance at all costs. Next up was Elementalist. I've decided I wanted a Reaver build, but unlike Vindicator, which can just swap from stances by pressing F1 in both directions, Reaver needs to deliberately alternate between F1 presses to swap to fire and F3 presses to get from fire to air. And there is no way I could have a very short rotation that works the same in both attunements because of it. In fact, I need to actually decide on a full loop beforehand. In addition, Sword 2 is a very strong ability in fire attunement, but it is rather undesirable in air attunement. So I can't just go and press 2 all the time, for example, as I've done with Willbender or with Vindicator. For all those reasons, I thought it was time to try something more complicated with Reaver and write down a rotation relatively explicitly. There are some tricks going on with instant casts and attunement swaps that allow for a surprising number of auto-attack chains to be actually finished. For example, in Air Fire, I just use the time to press instant cast abilities, so the auto-attacks we are supposed to do are executed without any interruption. One thing I find particularly cute is how I input Air 5 twice in the rotation, which will cause it to desync from Air 4 eventually due to cooldown issues, which ultimately leads to better fireworks relic uptime. Overall, this is the first build where I stopped doing something short and repetitive, but instead press the buttons in an order that I think is useful. As we move on to the remaining classes, the rotations might require more and more physically or mentally demanding inputs. For example, let's look at Condition Deadeye. Here the rotation loop is actually really short. You press 3, 2, 2, then go invisible and then press Stealth Attack 1. But the means by which I go invisible will vary in each loop. And somehow I also need to use my Venoms, which are also an insurance that the stealth attack does not end up being cancelled by the next ability, and they give enough time for reveal to run out too. So the way I'm using the Venoms here at the start of each loop, so we're going Venom, then 3, 2, 2, Stealth, 1. This way it just works out perfectly. So I've come up with this grid structure of a rotation. But it's quite challenging to play this precisely enough, and there are many random reveals I've gotten during my attempts that are honestly quite frustrating to deal with because it just kills the attempt once you fail to stealth. Nevertheless, the result speaks for itself. The damage is really good if it works out. This is in large parts because Condi Deadeye does a lot of damage, of course. Next, I've had some fun with Power Untamed. Here I wanted to try a rotation that actually involves weapon swaps. The problem with weapon swapping is that it counts as an input. This means that there's a lot of nothing for at least half a second after the weapon swap, unless you go at a crazy beat per minute. Though generally, if it can be avoided, I would have preferred to avoid using weapon swaps in any of these builds in the video. But yeah, I thought, what if I don't go for easy repeatable loops? Then I could try to come up with a nice, very long loop. So that's how this absolute monster of a rotation was created. Cornerstones are the requirement to press 2 hammer 4 and 3 hammer 2 on the hammer set. There's a lot of F key presses that are quite unnecessary. I press them to execute channels like the hammer ambush uninterrupted. On sword axe, I want to protect the axe 5 from being interrupted. So I use the time to unleash pet, press all the pet skills, then unleash ranger and go for the sword ambush. This is a pretty neat technology to deal with channels. The only other option would have been to repeatedly input the skill you're channeling, so pressing 5, 5, 5 during the axe 5, which is way less cool than doing this and using the time for something constructively. Next up, I wanted to do a boon support. So for Necro, I chose Quickness Harbinger. The loop is similar to what I do on Untamed. It's rather scrambled. The idea is to come up with something that loops in a bit more than 20 seconds to make sure the important skills can be used off cooldown. I achieved something around 27k DPS, which I think is decent, even though it's not very good for a Quickness build. I don't think weapon swaps would have made this much better, so I chose to run Offhand Torch, which requires me to get a different way to transfer the Blood is Power conditions to the enemy. That's why I decided to run the Plague Signet on this build. So you can see this is a slight deviation from the meta build, just as you saw with the Vindicator build running Chalice. Next, there's Mechanist. Here I chose something really simple, but spammy. 2, 5, 4, 3, 0, 7. Played at 130 beats per minute. It's actually more clever than what meets the eye. In particular, the Pistol 5 has the power to cancel another attack, so it is always used after the Sword 2. Sword 2 has a really short cast time and thus never gets cancelled. On the other hand, the Sword 3, one of our longest casts, is followed by an elite skill instant cast, which does not disturb the rotation in any way. The rotation has exactly the right pace to cast Throw Mine and Blowtorch essentially off cooldown. Unfortunately, I was not able to plan around the Sword 2 and Sword 3 cooldown reduction more, because the number of full auto chains you get in is really inconsistent. That was 8 classes, now the only one missing is Warrior. But for Warrior, whatever I tried, it mostly resulted in really poor DPS. It seems like Warrior relies a lot on proper skill queuing, and there's a lot of very awkward details that make this metronome playstyle simply fail. For example, Spellbreaker has movement abilities in the rotation, that mean you have to constantly readjust your character's positioning, which I can't do like this. Power Berserk is so timing sensitive that the abundance of cancelled auto hits makes it rather bad. I've not tried Bladesworn, but charging up a Dragon Trigger and keeping a certain pace do not seem like natural fits either when you think about it. So, for Warrior, I have not found a build or rotation I'm happy to share with you. Do you, the viewer, have an idea? If you can send me something that gets to 35k or at least close, I send you some Mystic Coins as a reward. I'm looking forward to ideas, and if I get something fun, I'll make a follow-up video. Alright, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching these ideas unfold as much as I enjoyed coming up with the different rotations. I've learned quite a bit about reducing certain rotations to the essential, how some cooldowns naturally line up, and how others absolutely do not. I'm kind of surprised how strong some of these rotations turned out to be. 35k DPS is a lot, especially because there's only minimal mechanical skill involved in this. I was hoping to reach maybe 30,000 DPS on some builds, but the fact that Condi Virtuoso turned out to be one of the weaker specimen at roughly 35k just amazes me. I wish you all a wonderful day. See you next time.